I would say there's a couple pieces that are histories of Pride. In general, the history of Pride really gets linked to the 1969 Stonewall riots, which were riots that happened in response to police violence and in terms of access to space that people who were gay and also gender nonconforming and sometimes identified at that point as crossdressers, sometimes identified as transvestites, and some of those people ended up identifying as transsexual or transgender. A wide range of people who come from a number of places being harassed by police while trying to occupy, in this case, the Stonewall Inn in New York. This is not the first time that people who are harassed by police for being gay or queer or gender nonconforming are harassed by the police or respond to it. So in trans history, we also look to, for example, the 1966 Compton's cafeteria riot, where people who were trans and gender nonconforming, sex workers especially, resisted police harassment in Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco. What is different about Stonewall from Compton's is the way that Stonewall became commemorated. So a few years after, basically the next year, it was a liberation parade designed to commemorate the uprising at Stonewall that eventually became Pride. So the reason that we have this history of Pride is because we have a history of a public remembrance. It was an act of history, right, of marking something in the past, of coming together collectively and marking something in the past and making an argument about its significance that turned Pride into Pride. And the other thing, and there's a religious scholar by the name of Heather White, who wrote a book called Reforming Sodom. And in that book, she argues that also Pride itself has a religious character, a kind of collective commemoration of a previous event that reinstantiates that event in the present. So it's a kind of both temporal reenactment, a performative character that builds community. And she understands that as having, in that practice, a kind of religious character. She's not saying that it's Christian. She's not saying that it's of a particular denomination, nor is she saying that it has a particular relationship to God or another deity, for example. But she says in that performance of commemoration and reinstantiating a past event, that is something that is a religious in character. So I would say that Pride is a fundamentally historical event, not just because it happened in the past, but because it became Pride, because it's a commemoration and argument about the meaning of a past event. But we can also understand it as something that is religious in character. I do think that actually the character of commemoration, of a kind of public remembrance of things in the past, is also something that's politically powerful. This is part of a lot of kinds of sort of public understandings of what holds a group together. So, for example, I'm a scholar of early American history. One of the things that was really significant, and it remains significant, but the instantiation of July 4th events. July 4th wasn't just important because it's the day that the Declaration of Independence is signed. It also, in marking it, marks the people who observe it. And this was something that is, in some ways, most obvious when people critique the both sort of community building aspect, but also the exclusionary character of that. I want to think very famously about Frederick Douglass writes a very famous speech called What to the Slave is the 4th of July, where he says the 4th of July marks something very specific. It marks who belongs to America, but also by naming these things, it marks people who don't belong to this. One of the critiques and concerns about Pride is who is included in this participation of Pride, and who is not included. So when we commemorate things, we are building community, we are marking who belongs in community. And so there are particular moments in the history of Pride where there have been efforts to broaden us understanding of who's included in Pride. One example I would say is the sort of invention isn't really the word I'm looking for, but in 1990, the trans pride flag was introduced and first flown in a Phoenix Pride parade. And the inclusion of that flag, the inclusion of that symbol, was also a marker as to sort of thinking about broadening an explicit statement of who is and isn't included in Pride, if that makes sense. So I think to sum up, commemorations mark people as part of communities by doing things together. The role of trans people in Pride, as well as the role of trans people in Stonewall, is a source of historic contention that I would say actually predates either of these things. So the history of trans and gender nonconforming people, and the history of people who are sexual minorities, and especially people who express or practice same-sex intimacy, are categories of people that have both overlapped. They've been understood as identical, and there has also been long histories of debate and questions about what, if any, the difference between these things is. And so particularly, I'm thinking about the emergence of the homophile movement in the 1950s and into the 1960s, which really stressed a new understanding that same-sex desire, intimacy, and relationships was something different than what had been called sexual inversion. That you could be a gender-normative man who loved and had sex with men who were also gender normative, or you could be a gender normative woman who loved and had sex with women who were also gender normative, and that expressing same-sex intimacy was not something that would remove you from the category of being considered a normal man or a normal woman. This was something that gay and lesbian activists were actively trying to fight because of a number of different kinds of social pressures. A couple of the most important were the pathologization of homosexuality and the ways in which the pathologization of homosexuality, and by pathologization I mean it was considered a mental illness, it was considered something that made somebody need treatment, and it was considered something that was grounds for legitimately firing somebody from a job, especially from jobs in the US government. So when people are arguing against considering homosexuality, being gay or lesbian, a disease, part of their justification is to argue that they are gender normal people. And this is, in some ways, historians consider this a kind of narrow-mindedness on the part of people within the homophile movement. There's certainly evidence of that. But it's also important to understand that this is a response to massive open discrimination against people who are expressing same-sex intimacy. And the people who are doing this considered in some ways, a very effective, although I would say it's only marginally effective, but an effective social tactic for arguing for rights in public space. So there is pre-existing tension between people who consider themselves gender normal homosexuals and people who express gender, a range of gender variant practices. They named those practices things like cross-dressing. They named themselves transvestites. Some of them just called themselves gay. And the term transsexual was emerging as a different kind of medical category and diagnosis. And a lot of people who engaged in gender variant behaviors, a lot of times people we would potentially now consider in the category of being drag queens, that was a term that was sometimes used and sometimes not. Those people sometimes called themselves gay. And so there is a lot of redefinition of terms and debate over who belongs to what category. This is happening within political movements, social movements. It's happening sort of in protests on streets, but it's also happening in bars and social spaces. So part of this question in terms of what is the role of trans and gender nonconforming individuals in Pride is also a question about what is the role of trans or gender nonconforming or gender variant people in the history of gender and sexual variation. And so when the Stonewall riots happen, one of the debates that is sort of, at this point, pretty fierce among some of its practitioners is whether or not, in particular, people like Sylvia Rivera, who is a Puerto Rican, she described herself variously as a drag queen, a transvestite, she described herself as gay, but she's generally understood as a transgender individual who is very, very prominent in advocating for early trans rights. And she gives accounts of being at Stonewall, and there are historians, especially gay white male historians, who say that she was not there. This was a riot. People didn't, to write down your evidence is to write down evidence of how you could be arrested. I mean, these are things that are contested by a number of different people. But as somebody who studies trans history, what I would argue is that trans people are there in these moments of opposition to police violence in these instances and take a very active role in uprisings both at Compton's and at Stonewall and other uprisings. These are not the only two uprisings that ever happened. And part of the way we see this in this history is a history of resistance. We also see trans people really at the center of police targeting, because to be gender variant is one of the ways that police targeted individuals who were considered gay. There's a long history of targeting gender variant individuals, and opposition to police violence is central to this history at Pride. I think I've taken us on a long journey through the role of trans people, but the key things I want to emphasize is that the debate over the relationship between gender variance and sexual variance is one that doesn't emerge at Pride. We see it come to a head in the moment of Stonewall, but also in debates since then. So one of the places this really explicitly comes to head in the early commemorations of Stonewall and early Pride festivals is in 1974 when Sylvia Rivera goes to speak at a Pride parade. She is basically attacked by two different contingents of people. One is feminists who were arguing that trans women and that basically people who were assigned male at birth engaging in any form of cross-dressing or feminine expression were essentially engaged in misogynistic mocking of women. That contingent of people, which I want to say was certainly not the only mode of feminism. There were a lot of trans-positive feminists in the early 70s as well, but a contingent of anti-trans feminists attacked and booed Sylvia Rivera and other trans women and tried to have them removed from the Pride stage. There were also contingents of people who saw themselves as gender-normative gays and lesbians who did not want trans people to be vocal representatives of what they saw as a normative community. And so Sylvia Rivera makes her way to stage, and she gives a speech which you can see on YouTube. I encourage you to see it. It's amazing. It's really heartrending. And one of the things she's calling back to, I said Pride is a commemoration, she is calling back to the history of police violence. And she is reminding the people who are celebrating Pride not to forget about the fact that gender variant people, especially poor and homeless youth, who are gender variant people who've been kicked out of their families for their families considering them deviant for being homosexual or trans or gay or lesbian, but that these often homeless youth of color, poor people engaging especially in sex work, people expressing gender non-normativity are being targeted by police and police violence, that they are being taken to jail, that they are homeless. And she gives an impassioned plea that in the course of Pride and in celebrating identities, that it is essential to remember that this is about fighting for the rights of really vulnerable people, and that it's kind of a prescient moment for seeing some of what we see as ongoing debates and really emotional fights about the meaning of Pride, whether or not this is for primarily wealthy and otherwise well-off people to have a party and have a good time, or if this is a political movement that is still invested in fighting for the rights of the most vulnerable people. So I would say that it's an ongoing debate that we can see happening even in the earliest moments and histories of Pride.